The structure rising behind Gareth Llewellyn's cabin looked like the burial mound of some long-dead beast. A 46-foot scar in the earth, now healed over with sod, led from a small limestone fissure to the foundation of his home. His neighbors, the scattered ranchers of Sweetwater country, saw only a strange and foolish effort, a tunnel of buried stone. But inside that cabin, through the brutal Wyoming winter of 1894, a miracle was unfolding. While every other stove in the county devoured a cord of wood every 10 days, Gareth's sipped at a single armload a day. The temperature outside would plummet to 32 below zero, yet the air flowing from a simple grate in his floor never dropped below 52 degrees. There was no fire in the tunnel, no engine, no magic. There was only the steady, silent breath of the deep earth, drawn into his home by a principle he had learned a mile underground, half a world away. The section crews and stock inspectors who rode the lonely plains saw a burrow, a den, a guaranteed collapse waiting to happen. They couldn't know they were looking at the answer to a question the frontier hadn't yet learned how to ask. If you stay with me, you'll learn the forgotten physics of how the ground beneath your feet can act as a furnace. It's a story about a man who brought a secret from the darkness of a Welsh coal mine into the blinding light of the American West. I promise the science is as compelling as the story. So subscribe and let us know in the comments. What's the cleverest low-tech solution you've ever seen for a modern problem? Gareth Llewellyn was not a rancher. He had never roped a calf or read a brand, and the vast horizontal emptiness of Wyoming was as foreign to him as the surface of the moon. He was not a carpenter, though he had built his own cabin. His hands were not shaped by the axe or the saw, but by the pick, the shovel, and the delicate brass key of a safety lamp. Gareth was a man of the deep earth, a colliery ventilation overman from the crowded, coal-dusted valleys of South Wales. For 14 years, his world had been the Quaimpark Pit, a labyrinth of man-made tunnels where the air itself was the enemy. His tools were a water gauge, a reel of twine, and the brass Davy lamp that still hung from his belt by habit, its polished surface a small sun against his denims. He would lift it at every doorway, a gesture as unconscious as breathing, checking for ghosts that did not exist here. His trade was the management of drafts, the shepherding of immense invisible rivers of air through miles of subterranean darkness. He didn't just feel the air, he read it. He could tell by the precise blue cap of the flame in his lamp if the methane was rising. He could tell by the whisper through a brattice cloth if a distant airway was blocked. His mentor, the colliery manager Jenkins, was a man who spoke of air pressure as if it were a living thing with moods and intentions. It was Jenkins who had taught him the foundational truth that would one day save him. On cold winter mornings, the surface drifts would falter, the air stalling as the temperatures inside and outside the mine equalized. But the deep airways, those cut 100 feet below the frost, always drew steady. Jenkins would have Gareth log the differentials on a slate, the numbers unwavering. "The deep earth," Jenkins would say, his voice echoing in the passage, "keeps its own counsel. It does not heed the seasons." Gareth had left that world for this one because of the air. The coal dust had settled deep in his own lungs, and deeper still in the lungs of his wife, Rhiannon. They had come to Wyoming for the clean, dry wind that scoured the plains, hoping it would scour their bodies clean as well. They had no children. A fever in her youth had taken Rhiannon's hearing, leaving her in a world of profound silence. She navigated her life by other means, by the vibration of footsteps on the floorboards, by the sudden pressure change of an opening door, and most of all, by the touch of air on her skin. She could feel a draft from across a room, a cold tendril that spoke of a poorly sealed window or a chink in the daubing. Her cheek was her barometer, her palm her thermometer. In their small cottage in Merthyr Tydfil, She had been the first to know when the winter wind shifted, her hands going still over her mending as she felt the change. Their first winter in Sweetwater country, in the conventional log cabin they built with more hope than knowledge, was a lesson in misery. The cold was a physical presence, an occupying force. The cast iron stove ticked and groaned all night, consuming cottonwood at an astonishing rate, a full cord every 10 days. Yet the far wall of their single room remained sheeted in a ghostly white frost. By supper the lamp wick would curl, stiff with cold. Gareth would watch Rhiannon sit by the fire, her shawl pulled tight, her palm held out not to the flames, but to the air beside her, reading the currents of cold that defied the stove's roaring heat. The cabin was a sieve, and the fire was simply a summons, its updraft pulling the brutal Wyoming winter in through 1,000 unseen cracks. That winter, Gareth didn't just feel the cold, he felt a professional failure. He, a master of air, had built a home that could not command its own breath. The problem wasn't merely the cabin's construction, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. The Wyoming cold was not the damp, blustery chill of the Welsh coast. It was a dry, still, penetrating force that operated by the remorseless laws of thermodynamics. In a conventional cabin, the fight against this cold was a losing battle of brute force. The settler's instinct was to seal every crack, to stuff every gap with rags and mud, to make the walls impenetrable. But this created a different trap. A sealed cabin becomes a stagnant box. The fire, the occupants, the cooking pots all consume oxygen and release moisture. The air grows thick, heavy, and damp. By morning, the inside of the windows are layered with ice, and the nail heads that pierce the logs from the outside are white with frost, conducting the cold directly into the living space. Worse, the fire itself became an unwitting traitor. A roaring stove requires a constant supply of air for combustion. In a sealed cabin, it gets this air by creating a powerful negative pressure, sucking the very cold it's meant to defeat through the tiniest, most obscure pathways, under the doorsill, through the floorboards, around the window frames. Every log thrown on the fire was an invitation for more Arctic air to force its way inside. The result was a room of stark contrasts, a scorching bubble of heat 3 feet from the stove, and a zone of bitter cold everywhere else. Gareth saw this failure mirrored in every ranch across the 40-mile spread of the valley. He'd shared a cup of coffee in the foreman Koenig's cabin, a well-built structure by any standard, and felt the icy draft that sliced across the floor, chilling his ankles while his face was flushed from the heat of the stove. Koenig fought it by burning more fuel, even resorting to scavenged railroad ties that burned hot and fast. The stock inspector, Prentice, had hung heavy horse blankets over his doors and windows, plunging his home into a gloomy twilight in a futile attempt to trap the warmth. His family lived in a single room, the air thick with the smell of old wool and stale wood smoke. The logic was flawed. A bigger fire just created a more powerful vacuum. A tighter seal just made the incoming drafts more vicious and concentrated. The problem seemed insoluble. To be warm, you had to burn fuel. To burn fuel, you had to feed your fire with the very cold you were trying to escape. It was a perfect, self-defeating loop. Gareth knew there had to be another way. He didn't need a bigger fire. He needed better air. The memory of Jenkins's slate surfaced one morning in late spring. He was standing outside, watching the last of the snow melt from the high pastures, the air clean and sharp. He remembered the numbers, the unwavering draw of the deep airways. The earth, Jenkins had said, keeps its own counsel. It was then that the idea took root, an idea so counterintuitive it felt like a revelation. Everyone fought the cold at the walls of their house. What if the fight began 50 feet away and 8 feet underground? He wasn't going to block the cold air. He was going to invite it in, but on his own terms, through a pathway of his own design. He would not build a fortress against the winter, he would build a channel through the earth's deep, abiding warmth. He spent weeks walking his parcel of land, not looking at the grazing potential, but at the geology. He found it 100 yards behind the cabin, a low, weathered outcrop of limestone, with a deep fissure running into the hillside. It was a natural intake, a place where the earth already breathed. This would be his starting point, his connection to the thermal stability Jenkins had measured on his slate. In late August, the work began. The digging of the trench was brutal, punishing labor. The Wyoming soil was a dense mix of clay and stone, baked hard by the summer sun. He dug a line, straight as a surveyor's mark, from the limestone fissure toward the cabin's foundation. He went down past the topsoil, past the dense clay, down until the earth grew cooler and damper to the touch. He dug until his trench was 8 feet deep, well below the frost line he estimated for this latitude. The trench was 46 feet long. It was a feature so large it altered the landscape, a raw wound in the prairie. His materials were not milled lumber or store-bought brick. They were the stones of the land itself, cleared from the fields, pulled from the creek bed. He began to build within the trench, not a wooden tunnel, but a dry stone culvert, a technique as old as the hills of Wales. He laid a floor of flat stones and then built up the sides, carefully choosing and fitting each rock. There was no mortar. The integrity of the structure came from the precise placement of the stones, their weight locking them together. He was creating a hollow, rectangular tube of rock, an artery laid deep within the ground. The neighbors, what few there were, took notice. Their world was one of wood and cattle. This work with stone and earth was foreign. Koenig, the Union Pacific Section foreman, rode out one Thursday afternoon, reining in his horse at the edge of the trench. He was a practical man. His authority derived from his deep knowledge of how this harsh land defeated the works of men. "That alkali dirt, Lewid," he said, gesturing with his chin at the piles of excavated earth. "It eats wood. Saw a sodded cellar down at Rawlins. The cribbing turned to powder in 2 seasons. Floor just dropped out one morning." His voice wasn't mocking, but cautionary. It was an offering of hard-won local knowledge. Gareth looked up from his work, his hands covered in dust. "No cribbing?" he said. "Just stone." Koenig grunted, unconvinced, and rode on. A week later, Prentice, the stock inspector, passed by on his rounds. He paused, looking down at the long stone-lined ditch. "Building a burrow, Welshman?" he called out. Gareth simply nodded and fit another capstone into place. Even the circuit rider, who stopped for a drink of water in September, surveyed the strange construction and remarked, "A den for the winter, Mr. Lewid. Let's pray it proves a safe one." Each man saw what his experience allowed him to see: a hole, a tunnel, a structure doomed to rot and collapse. They saw the method, but they could not see the principle. Gareth worked with a quiet, methodical rhythm. He was not racing the coming winter, he was keeping an appointment with it. He finished the stone culvert, laying heavy flat rocks across the top to form a solid roof. Then he carefully backfilled the trench, burying his work, returning the prairie sod to the surface, until all that remained was the modest opening at the limestone fissure, and the point where the stone channel disappeared into the foundation of his cabin. Inside, he had removed a section of the floorboards. The culvert terminated in a small plenum built of rock directly beneath the floor. Over this, he cut a simple register, a 6 by 12-inch hole covered with a piece of drilled iron plate. For the outlet, he relied on his stovepipe, ensuring it was tall, clean, and drew well. The system was now a complete, closed loop. An intake 50 feet away, a long underground passage, an entry into the house, and an exhaust high above the roof. The work was finished on a cold, still morning in late October. The air was sharp, and the ground was hard with the first deep frost. This was the moment of truth. Before the sun had fully risen, Gareth walked to the intake by the limestone outcrop. The air was so still he could hear the ticking of the watch in his pocket. He unhooked the brass Davy lamp from his belt. Its small flame burned with perfect steadiness. He held it up to the mouth of the culvert. He watched the flame cap, the tiny, sensitive blue aura he had once used to read the presence of methane. For a full minute, he held it there. The flame did not bend or flicker. It did not dance. It simply leaned gently and inexorably into the dark opening. The pull was not a gust or a draft, but a slow, constant, undeniable inhalation. The earth was breathing. He walked back to the cabin. Inside, Rhiannon was kneeling on the floor. Her head was bowed, her cheek turned towards the newly installed register. She had been there for 10 minutes, in the silent world that was hers, feeling for a message from the earth. As Gareth stepped through the door, she looked up. Her eyes met his, and she nodded. Once, a single, certain gesture. The air touching her skin was not the biting cold of the October morning. It was cool, yes, but it was a living cool, the steady 50-degree breath of the deep ground. The system was alive. What Gareth had built was an elegant, self-regulating heat engine, powered by the fundamental physics of the planet. Engineers today call it an earth-air heat exchanger, a core principle of passive building design. But for Gareth, it was simply the logic of the Kabadiwan Park pit, inverted and brought into the light. The science is rooted in a simple, massive fact. The Earth is a colossal thermal battery. In Wyoming, the top 6 feet of soil are subject to the wild swings of the seasons, freezing solid in winter and baking hard in summer. But below that level, at a depth of 8 feet, where Gareth laid his culvert, the temperature of the ground remains remarkably constant year-round, holding steady between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit. This immense thermal mass absorbs the summer's heat and releases it slowly through the winter, a reservoir of gentle, permanent warmth. The system operated on a 3-part principle: stack effect, earth coupling. The first part was the earth coupling itself. The 46-foot buried culvert acted as a giant heat exchanger. On a day when the outside air was a brutal 20 degrees below zero, that frigid air would be drawn into the culvert's opening. As it began its journey toward the cabin, it was surrounded on all sides by stone walls that were in direct contact with the 50-degree soil. Over the 46-foot run, the air had no choice but to surrender its intense cold to the surrounding earth and absorb its warmth. By the time that parcel of air reached the plenum beneath Gareth's floor, it had been naturally and effortlessly pre-tempered from minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit to a consistent 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The second part of the engine was the stack effect. Any fire, even the small, efficient one in Gareth's stove, heats the air around it. This warm air becomes less dense and more buoyant, and it naturally rises. As it flowed up and out of the tall, clean stovepipe, it created a slight but persistent area of low pressure inside the sealed cabin. This is the same principle that makes a chimney draw. The third and final part was the passive flow, the genius of the system. In a conventional cabin, this low pressure is a curse, sucking freezing air through every available crack. But in Gareth's cabin, the easiest path for replacement air was the one he had designed: the large, unobstructed opening of the floor register. Nature, abhorring a vacuum, filled the low-pressure zone not with minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit blasts from the window frames, but with a gentle, continuous flow of 50 degrees Fahrenheit air from the earth tube. The system was a self-regulating convective loop. The hotter the fire, the stronger the stack effect, and the more 50-degree air was drawn from the ground. When the fire died down, the draw slowed. The fire's only job was no longer the impossible task of raising the air temperature by 100 degrees from minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Its new, much simpler job was to lift the air by a mere 20 degrees, from the 50 degrees Fahrenheit provided by the Earth to a comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The savings in energy and firewood were astronomical. It was a reduction in heating load of nearly 80%. The armload of wood per day was not a miracle. It was a matter of thermal arithmetic. He had taken the lessons of the deep mines, designed to manage deadly, stagnant air, and used them to create a system that breathed fresh, living, warm air. That winter started quietly, with the usual succession of snows and cold snaps. The system performed exactly as Gareth had calculated. The small stove ticked over, the cabin stayed a comfortable 65 degrees, and the woodpile seemed to shrink at an impossibly slow rate. Rhiannon moved through the space with a new serenity. The violent drafts that had been the bane of her existence were gone, replaced by a single, steady, gentle warmth that rose from the center of the floor. She could sit at the table and do her mending for hours, her fingers never growing stiff. The windows would gather a fine lace of frost at their edges, but the main panes remained clear, offering a view of the stark, white landscape. Then, in the second week of January, the weather changed. A Great Basin polar vortex descended upon the territory. It was not a blizzard. There was no wind, no driving snow. It was a quiet, suffocating cold. For 12 straight days, the temperature never rose above 20 below zero, and at night, it plunged to minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was so dry and thin it felt sharp in the lungs. In the afternoons, the low sun was flanked by sundogs, mock suns created by ice crystals in the atmosphere, a sure sign of profound, stable cold. It was the kind of weather that broke machinery and spirits. Inside Gareth and Rhiannon's cabin, life continued with an almost surreal normalcy. The stove consumed slightly more wood, perhaps an armload and a half a day, but it never roared. The air was always fresh, the humidity stable. The far wall was cool to the touch, but there was no frost on it. The nail heads were just nail heads. One morning, during the worst of the cold, Gareth tore a small, 1-inch square from a piece of tissue paper. He held it over the floor register. The paper did not flutter or dance. It lifted on the incoming column of air and hung there, suspended and perfectly steady, as if resting on an invisible shelf. It remained there all morning, a silent, absolute testament to the constant, gentle breathing of the house. Word from the rest of the county, delivered by the bundled-up section crew, was grim. Koenig's fight against the cold had become a desperate siege. He was burning through his wood supply at a dangerous rate and had taken to supplementing it with precious railroad ties stockpiled for track repairs. Prentice, the stock inspector, had lost nearly half of his newborn calves, the small animals freezing in the barn despite the heat lamps. His family was confined to the kitchen, the rest of the house abandoned to the cold. At every ranch, the story was the same. A losing war against an invading force, fought in cabins that were sealed, stagnant, and still freezing. The vindication, when it came, was as quiet and understated as Gareth himself. It arrived not in a single moment of triumph, but in a series of small, unheralded encounters, the truth dawning on others, one by one. On the 5th day of the deep freeze, there was a sharp knock on the door. It was a young crewman from Koenig's team, a man named Miller. A bolt on a track spreader had sheared off in the cold, and he was walking the line looking for it. He stepped inside, stamping the snow from his boots, his face raw from the cold. He unwrapped the wool scarf from his neck, his breath pluming in the air. Then he went still. He looked around the room. Gareth was at the table, methodically cleaning the glass of his Davy lamp. Rhiannon was at the counter, rolling out dough for bread. The air was wrong. It was warm, but it was a gentle, ambient warmth, not the focused, oppressive heat of a stove pushed to its limit. After a moment of clear confusion, Miller silently unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat, the one he hadn't taken off indoors in a week, and draped it over the back of a chair. His eyes followed Rhiannon as she moved to the stove, her head tilted slightly as if listening. He watched her check the kettle, not by looking at it, but by extending her hand to feel the current of rising steam against her skin. He got the spare bolt he'd come for and left with few words, his expression thoughtful. 4 days later, on day 9, another visitor. This time it was Schmidt, an older, veteran crewman. He carried a timesheet that needed Gareth's signature for some timber they had hauled before the cold set in. He stepped across the threshold and underwent the same subtle transformation. He stopped, his senses recalibrating. Schmidt had spent 20 winters in Wyoming. He knew with bone-deep certainty what a cabin was supposed to feel like at 30 below. It was supposed to feel like a battleground, a place of drafts and smoke and a constant roaring fire. This room felt like a calm May afternoon. He too removed his coat without being asked. His gaze fell on the small square of tissue paper still hovering, impossibly, over the grate in the floor. He watched Rhiannon pour him a mug of tea, navigating the space with the quiet confidence of a person perfectly attuned to her environment. He said nothing about the warmth. He simply signed his paper, nodded to Gareth, and walked back out into the killing cold. On the 11th day, a third man, a stranger working a short stint with the railroad, knocked on the door. The pump at the section house was frozen solid, and he needed to fill a water jug from Gareth's well, which, sunk deep and well-housed, still flowed. He stepped inside, and the now familiar sequence played out. The pause. The slow scan of the impossibly normal room. The unbuttoning of the coat. He saw the floating piece of paper. He saw the woman who read the air. He filled his jug, mumbled his thanks, and left, carrying with him a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. The true moment of collective understanding happened 2 days later, after the cold had finally broken. It was Thursday, the day the weekly supply train made its flag stop. The air was still frigid, but breathable. A small group of men were gathered by the tracks: Koenig, Prentice, and the 3 crewmen, Miller, Schmidt, and the stranger. They stood apart from one another, not talking, their shoulders hunched against the wind. They weren't looking at each other, but they were all aware of each other. Each of the 3 crewmen carried the memory of that warm, quiet room. They held it as a private, physical truth that contradicted everything they knew about winter. They didn't speak of it. They didn't need to. In a land where survival was a constant roar of wind and fire, Gareth Lewid had built a house that listened. The silence between the men at the flag stop was the loudest possible admission. It wasn't a burrow. It wasn't a den. It was an answer. That spring, the idea began to spread, not through words, but through imitation. Koenig was seen digging a long trench behind his own cabin. His was shorter, and not as deep as Gareth's, a compromise born of skepticism and pride. He never asked Gareth for a single piece of advice, but from a distance, he copied the principle. That summer, 2 bachelor ranchers to the south, having heard the story from Schmidt over a bottle of whiskey, spent a month digging their own earth tubes. By the autumn of 1895, 4 households across Sweetwater County had a stone culvert, breathing pre-warmed air into their floors. There were no articles written in the Cheyenne papers, no manuals published. The knowledge passed quietly, ranch to ranch, a piece of observed, undeniable truth that worked. Today, building scientists and engineers would recognize Gareth's design instantly. They call it an earth-air heat exchanger, a key component in modern passive house construction. They use insulated polyethylene pipes, calculate flow rates with software, and sometimes add fans to boost the circulation. But the core principle that Gareth Lwyd understood, with a Davy lamp and a memory of a Welsh coal pit, remains precisely the same. The Earth itself is the most reliable furnace and the most constant air conditioner we will ever have. The brass lamp on Gareth's belt was a tool born of fear, designed to read the faint signs of poison in the dark. Its purpose was to detect fire damp, the colorless, odorless gas that could turn a mine into a tomb with a single spark. It was an instrument that searched for the absence of life. In the vast open spaces of Wyoming, the lamp's original purpose was gone, but the habit of carrying it remained. It became something new. When Gareth lifted it to the mouth of his stone culvert, he was still reading the air, but now he was reading a living current, a steady draft that spoke of warmth and safety. For Rhiannon, the transformation was even more profound. Her silent world was a landscape of touch and pressure. In their first winter, the cabin had assaulted her senses with a language of suffering, the sharp, painful drafts that cut across the room, the vibrating shudder of the logs in the wind. The house was a source of constant, chaotic torment to her sensitive skin. But Gareth's innovation had changed the very language of her home. The chaotic noise of the drafts was gone, replaced by a single, coherent, steady voice. It was the warm, reliable breath from the floor, a current she could trust, a presence that meant safety. A lamp meant to read killing air underground had learned to read living air above it. The draft kept faith with a woman who lived by it. If you found this story of frontier ingenuity as fascinating as we did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten wisdom. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any modern application of these methods should be undertaken in compliance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.